Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we are joined by Edmunds Editor-in-Chief Alistair Weaver, who has gracefully agreed to join us and have a conversation about some of the questions that we've had on some of the Edmunds range testing. Obviously, you guys have done a little bit of testing a few months back on a number of different electric vehicles. Tesla gave you a call about that, a little bit unhappy with some of the results in terms of not accounting for maybe some of the range that was available after the indicated range hit 0 miles. So you guys did a little bit of retesting on that this week and published your findings on that. So I think we can kind of start there. First off, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and have this conversation. But yeah, maybe just walk us through, Tesla giving you guys the call and then some of that retesting that you guys have done.
Sure. Firstly, Rob, thanks for having me on. It's always good to. I know you've been covering some of what we've been doing pretty intensely, so it's always nice to have the opportunity to come on and talk about it. You're right. I mean, Edmunds, we have a long history of testing EVs. I mean, I've been in my current role for 3 years, but I've been associated with the company for 10 or more. And I think we were on the original launch of the Model S. I think we've owned 5 Teslas. If I get that right: Model S, Model X, 2 Model 3s, Model Y. And personally, I've driven every Tesla going back to the Roadster. So we're coming at it from that perspective. And obviously, we are a consumer-led publication. So everything's about a consumer-first philosophy. So we're testing basically every EV that comes up. I mean, we test 300 vehicles a year across the whole industry, and every EV. So we felt it was really important to develop a range test that actually was sort of consumer first, and it's something that actually people could relate to in the real world, with all the caveats that comes with that, of course.
Sure. So when you guys published the original findings, the main headline that you guys went with was, Tesla misses EPA range on every single vehicle that you guys have tested. And I think that's
Yeah,
probably what led to the call from Tesla, explaining a
sure.
little bit about the buffer. And then you guys have now retested that. So just want to give us a little bit of detail on that retest.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, let's just deal with the first thing about the EPA. I think what you've got to look at this from is really a consumer perspective. And what we're saying to somebody, people look at the EPA figures and say, great, that means that, if Auntie Annie lives 220 miles away, then I can drive 220 miles to Auntie Annie and all is well with the world. I think we all recognize that's not necessarily the case. The EPA tests are done in a laboratory condition. And obviously, if you live in California versus Michigan or whatever, wherever it may be, it's going to could potentially be wildly different. So that was the basis. So what we're saying to consumers is, we have done a real world test in Southern California, and that's why we disclose things like temperatures and where we are and everything else. And we believe, this is a guide. It's another point of information to sit alongside the EPA numbers. So the whole point of saying actually the Teslas didn't hit the EPA, well, pretty much with the exception of one Polestar, which just missed, every other brand was significantly ahead of the EPA figures. So it was an important thing to call out that not the Teslas are actually behind the EPA numbers. Pretty much everybody else was ahead, and in certain instances, like the Taycan, it was 60% ahead. So that was a really important thing to call out to consumers. It's not the same thing as saying like Teslas have a bad range and everything else. I mean, look, I own a model. I should say this at the episode. I own a Model 3. The black one in the test is actually my wife's car. So, the Model 3 is Edmunds' top-rated vehicle of the last 2 years, our top-rated EV. So we're actually fans of the product. But that's not the same thing as saying, okay, we can't start to explain to consumers, some of the differences between brands and, whether EPA ratings are really a good guide or not and what this relates to. So the idea was to come up with a real-world test that provided a level playing field as close as you possibly can be on real roads. And that then became a fair criticism of Tesla to say on our test roads they didn't hit the EPA figures, so beware of that. Whereas these other brands did. It's a kind of interesting situation. You have Porsche claiming just 200 miles for Taycan, Tesla claiming 300 odd for certain models, and actually in the real world they're performing in the same way. Now, in the Taycan's case, for specific reasons for that, gearboxes, things like that. But this is important consumer information to put forward. There's no agenda. There's not about to get Tesla or anything like that. This is just relevant consumer information because, we have 20 million people a month visiting Edmunds. This is not, we are not catering to early adopters or technology geeks or whatever. This is, real people buying real cars. And these days, people are buying a Model Y or a Model 3 as an alternative to a CR-V or a RAV4. So giving them relevant consumer information becomes critical.
Sure. And I think that's, that last part of what you said. Like, I agree with everything you're saying. It is important to have these comparisons in more of a real world environment. But when we're talking about, a consumer that's maybe new to electric vehicles, one of the biggest questions that I have about the comparisons that are being made is relating to temperature. So for example, the one you guys just tested, the long range Model 3, you got 345 miles out of it at 53-degree temperatures versus the EPA range of 353 miles. So it's like, oh, Tesla missed again, not a huge difference. But because that was tested at 53 degrees versus something like the Porsche Taycan, I think it's tested at 72 degrees, there's a huge difference there in terms of the test conditions. And that can have, based on, I think it's Geotab, they did a comparison across like 4,200 electric vehicles and the range they get at different temperatures and things like that. That can have like a 15-20% hit on range. So that's where it's like, okay, if Edmunds is going to go with this headline of Tesla's missing in every category, they should be at least testing it in similar conditions to, what they're testing the Taycan at, where it's, if you had 20%, 15% on that 345 miles, you're easily ahead of the EPA range. And there's similar issues with the other ones. A lot of the Teslas are tested at lower 60 degrees versus a lot of the other EVs around 70 degrees, which when you're using climate control and things like that, definitely can add up. So that combined with the buffer stuff where, Tesla maybe has a little bit more EPA range or a little bit more actual range available than what they're indicating. It's just a couple of things in there that maybe weren't being fully accounted for that, again, someone that's newer to electric vehicles may not fully understand based on how it's being presented.
The temperature thing's an interesting. I know you quote the study based on average and things like that. The reality is, and again, this comes back to what you're saying about the development of the market. In our experience, we don't. If you look at say the Taycan or the Audi e-tron, they're 800 volt systems. They're a very different. They have a very different way of managing temperatures to what Tesla or a lot of other vehicles do. So I don't think it's quite as clear. If I'm honest, I probably disagree a little bit about how clear cut you're suggesting it is. Temperatures, if you look at, our Mustang Mach-E was done in 62 degrees, Chevy Bolt was 60 degrees. We live in Southern California. Obviously, these tests have been done every time a vehicle comes out. We're in a fortunate position that Edmunds is based in LA. It is pretty temperate around here, but clearly we're not getting 30, I don't know how many vehicles we've done now, I can't even count, but 30, 40 vehicles together in a single day and driving. You have to be realistic about this. The temperature differences that we're finding aren't necessarily as severe as what you're suggesting from that study, and we are aware of that study. And also, of course, as this technology evolves, and Tesla themselves are working on this, how you manage battery temperature and how that impacts on range is changing all the time as well. So the idea of disclosing the temperature was to try and be as transparent as possible with everybody. And as we say in the blurb that goes with the test, it can have an impact. And what we're saying here, no test is perfect. The EPA's is laboratory based, but that has its own issues, as I think we're all aware. Ours, we're saying, look, this is a real world approximation, and these are the call outs that you need to be aware of. This wasn't headline grabbing, it was just something that was pretty stark in the results, is that everybody else was basically comfortably exceeding EPA. Tesla wasn't. There's a lot of reasons for that. And if you're a consumer, that's a good thing to know. Me as a Model 3 buyer, wouldn't stop me buying a Model 3, but it's something you should be aware of because my wife has a pretty big commute, or did before all this started.
Yeah, maybe back to that soon, but
yeah, we haven't done as many miles as we expected.
Yeah, everything you're saying there totally, it makes sense. I guess it's just it would be great to have more similar test conditions, which obviously you can't control the weather. It's just when the headline is bucketing Tesla in that way, and Tesla's average test temperature is quite a bit lower than the rest of the vehicles. It's just, to me, obviously I'm a Tesla supporter, Tesla investor, Tesla customer, things like that. But really what I want to, I don't care if Tesla misses the EPA range. What I really want is just to know how these vehicles compare on like an even playing ground, which if you when you guys did this retest.
To jump in for a moment there, Rob, if you look at like the Mach-E, which is probably the Tesla's biggest rival right now, philosophically at least, that's at 62 degrees. So, that's not, we're not talking about wild differences. I was pulling it up in front of me as you were talking.
Yeah.
Model 3 performance was tested at 61 degrees. standard range plus was actually at 67 degrees, whereas the Mach-E was at 62. So, you know, we're not talking about wild differences. It's not like Michigan where you can be at, you know, minus something and then plus a lot. So,
Yeah.
you know, there's pretty modest differences.
Yeah. And it is important to understand, like, temperatures are going to vary in the real world too, and people should be aware of, you know, that has an impact on range for sure. It's the same with,
one thing with,
you know, internal combustion engine vehicles too. It's just people don't really, you know, think about it in the same way that they do EVs.
And I think that's something that we're always really keen to message in everything we say. It's also why we run the vehicles on the long-term test program. And, you know, we've run hundreds of thousands of miles in Teslas. And the reason for doing that is actually to sort of normalize range, things like that, because actually, you know, we have 30 people in the team, the cars get shared around. So you get different driving styles, different commutes. We used to different commutes, different all sorts of things. And, you know, you and I well know that if you drive like most Tesla drivers in LA, you know, you're not going to get close to our number, never mind the EPU range. And we do call out. We drive, you know, sensibly and conservatively. We don't exceed speed limits. We don't accelerate vigorously. You know, if you want to enjoy your ludicrous mode, you're not going to get those figures, right?
That's definitely the case for sure. Just because we were talking about the temperatures though. So we were talking, you know, kind of the Mach-E versus the Model Y would obviously be the comparison there. So you guys originally tested the Model Y at 65 degrees, and then you guys did the track test, found out there might be a little bit of additional buffer, retested the Model Y, got the exact same 263-mile range. But it looked like, again, that was in like the 50-degree test temperature versus 65. So I read in the Edmunds report that Edmunds took that as a validation of those original tests. And then it looks like none of the other Tesla vehicles have been updated, which that's probably one of my biggest issues at this point in time with how this is being reported. Because if you look at the EPA consumption versus the miles of range that Edmunds efficiency numbers versus the miles of range that Edmunds was able to get out of it, the variance between the actual range versus EPA and the actual consumption versus EPA is way, way larger for Tesla. Like the consumption numbers, the efficiency numbers, they're hitting what the EPA standard was, but the range is not even coming close, which was kind of an indicator to me originally that, okay, that Tesla's has a bigger buffer here, and that looks like is still the case from how this is being reported. And it looked like the Model Y test was being used to validate those other numbers, but again, the test conditions were so different with, you know, a 15-degree temperature difference there, which is significant. That it seems like, I don't know, not that those all need to be retested, but it just seems misleading to have those all on the same chart then with that huge difference in buffer.
Yeah, firstly, I think the efficiency thing was something that, you know, interested us, that there was this discrepancy. And, you know, it's interesting at the moment, all the conversation is about range. I think that, you know, before too long, when EV take-up continues to increase and people think more about how much electricity is costing, the efficiency is going to become more and more of an issue. We'll probably talk less about range because I think that'll normalize, and we'll talk about efficiency. I don't think there's a direct correlation. We have looked into this, and there are a few things that are still a little bit unclear. But essentially, I don't think there's a direct correlation, as you might think, between efficiency and range. You can't just put one together the other, because it led us to believe also, and this was part of when Tesla made the call and said, you know, there's this whole buffer that you're not really considering, and the EPA does consider, and you're not. That the fact the efficiency thing was a bit of a driver to say, okay, let's go and test this out. And it you know, obviously proved that there wasn't a big disparity between Tesla and other brands, and there wasn't a consistent buffer either. So yeah, we looked at that, but I don't think there's such a direct correlation.
Okay, I guess I'm not really fully understanding like why that would be, because they should be directly correlated. You know, the more efficient you are, the more range you're going to get out of the same capacity of energy.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of. I'm not a battery engineer, Rob, so I throw that. But yeah, I mean, I think there are probably a few things that we want to dig into a bit more on that, because as a layman, you would look at it and say, well, it's like miles per gallon, whatever it would be. But yeah, we're not seeing a direct correlation. That's for sure.
Okay. Just from the numbers that you guys have presented, it looks like Tesla, on average, was showing an 11% difference in those numbers between like EPA range versus Edmunds range, efficiency versus Edmunds efficiency, 11% difference. All the other vehicles, 1% difference. So again, I do think that's definitely leading to some of the differences in the comparison here.
I don't think
So
it's
yeah,
1%. I don't think it's 1% difference, Rob. I think there are significant differences if you look at the chart. I mean, it's all on. If you head to
there are significant differences. I'm talking about the differences between the two numbers. So like if you go down the column of like
oh yeah,
Edmunds
I
miles versus
understand your point.
EPA, you'll get anywhere from like 60% to like
Yeah.
negative 2%.
Uh,
But those numbers line up well with the efficiency differences as well. I'm saying the spread between those is very small for the other vehicles, but very large for Tesla.
I understand what you're saying, and that's why that was one of the interesting things is to go and do the buffer test. I guess all we can do is we can't drive the thing further than they will go. All we can do is kind of do the test and do it as fairly and equitably as possible. And our test team they're engineers. I'm not an engineer, they are, but they are utterly fastidious in how we go about testing. And so we did as much as we possibly could to normalize everything, and then all we can do is run the test and report the results. And we can all sort of look and say, well, I'm a little bit unsure about that and that, but that's the reality. You asked me a question earlier, which I thought we was talking about why we didn't update the range thing. Again, it comes back to the consumer first thing. We're basically taking a decision that the range should not, including a buffer, is not something that we would recommend to the consumer. So what we're continuing to do is quote our range figures down to 0 miles indicated, because we feel that's a better real world measure. It's more relevant to the consumer, and also because, as we've shown, the buffer is so variable. We were surprised. And not just us, we've spoken, as you know, because it's in the article, we've spoken to Volkswagen, Ford, Tesla. Everybody was a bit surprised that we got less miles in city, in a mix of highway and city driving in the buffer than we did at a constant speed, which feels initially counterintuitive. But again, there's a lot of variables, how the computer's working. There's a lot of things going on, and I think even I know this because they talk to them. Even some of the brightest minds in the world working on this in the engineering community can't yet explain everything because the technology is so new and it's evolving so fast. And what was fascinating to us in this test is how sophisticated all these cars are. The warnings about when you're about to run out of juice, what that looks like, the fact that every single vehicle was able to pivot onto its 12-volt battery so it could be put on the tow truck. There's a lot of super clever stuff going on here, and that's what we find so exciting, and that's why I kind of love the job that I do. And it's Tesla's done a great job of pioneering a lot of this stuff and leading the way, and now everybody else is catching up in many ways. And like anything in a market, others will get it more right in certain areas, and Tesla it just becomes a big game now, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. It's super, I mean, that's why we talk about it every day. It's super interesting to follow. On
Yeah.
that buffer test, did you guys just kind of like coast down from 65, like once it was no longer going 65?
Yeah, we took a view, the whole 65 thing. So we crossed the 0 at 65, which was really, and the reason, there's other conversation about why, the range, the idea was not to get a range test at 65 miles an hour. The idea was to normalize the conditions so everybody hits 0 in the same conditions. That's why also we haven't quoted the figures, because that wasn't the point. The point was to get everybody down to 0 in the same conditions and then to measure the buffer. So we basically then did effectively ran it at 65 miles an hour till we'll go no further. The view on that being that that's obviously a safe highway speed, certainly in California, but a lot of the country as well. And then basically measured that as a distance, and then basically as it started to deteriorate, how much further would it go till it literally, last bit of momentum crawled its way off the track, as you can see in the video.
Yeah, that's probably, I think, because for the Model 3 long range, for example, you guys I think got like 27 extra miles on the track, but only 17 in the real world test. My first thought was, well, it probably has to do with like starting and stopping in the real world test versus just coast down on the oval test. That was my first guess. Do you think that could be related?
Yeah, but then also stopping and starting also introduces regen, which you don't have at 65 miles an hour. So again, it's another one of those which took us a little bit by surprise. I mean, Tesla came back, as we show in the video, with an explanation for that based on the sort of how it's driving right now and how it's just driven. So again, a lot of that's the computers, how it's working out what 0 range is, because of course in all these cars, as we know, sort of 0 is an indicated range based on a number of factors, and that was why it was so important to normalize it. and also we did it at a test track because, if you're running that many vehicles, there's a safety of my team, and there's a sort of social responsibility as well of, not running out of juice in the 405.
Yeah. Don't want to do that. That all makes sense.
Don't want to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate you guys like sharing the buffer information. I thought that was super helpful, and I hadn't seen anyone else do that sort of test. Again, some of my qualms are just with, how the data is presented. It feels like it penalizes Tesla a little bit right now for having a little bit larger of a buffer. I get that maybe you don't want to count on that as a consumer if it's consumer facing, but then it's sort of, for other electric vehicle manufacturers that are maybe making decisions based on some of these reporting tests that are done by third parties, it sort of incentivizes them to reduce that safety buffer, which is, that's disadvantageous for consumers too. So,
but if you look at the figures, I mean, the ID4 had more buffer than the Model Y Performance. The long range, as you'd probably expect, given it's a long range, a lot more battery to play with. That did go further. But if you look at the Standard Range Plus, and the was not too dissimilar to the ID4. The Model Y was marginally less than the ID4, and then the Mach-E was behind, but not. We're talking about a handful of miles, and we spoke to Ford's engineers. They take a slightly different philosophy, and they try and be much more explicit about zero being zero in the way that they offer warnings and things like that. I mean, I don't think having it's the same with gas cars or diesel cars, whatever it may be. They have, they have a bit of an inherent buffer. But our big thing to consume, I was actually out in my Model 3 at the weekend and got down to 6 miles, and I live near a supercharger. But then in my head, I was like, there's a bit of a buffer. And I was like, I wonder how long this actually is, because I've been driving around town. And so I just don't think as a consumer, you should be playing with, I reckon I've got 10 miles of buffer because actually I've been driving like this for the last hour. I don't know. It's just not a world you should be in. The idea is to get you safe, but realistically, I think, particularly while charging infrastructure continues to build, I mean, I would never take my vehicle, even doing 10, 20, 25 miles of zero. So, we have to think about the, your audience here is obviously, extremely enthusiastic about this technology. We're talking to an audience who, are sort of delving into EVs for the first time, and Tesla has its own audience, but Ford, Volkswagen, and others need to sell. If this is going to work, they need to sell Mach-E's and ID4s and everything else to CRV customers and RAV4 customers, not even really Tesla customers necessarily. And if Tesla's going to continue to grow, likewise, they need to get more adopters.
Yeah, for sure. You did mention not publishing the full range results from the buffer test, which it makes sense. That's a very different test than sort of like a real world test. But I would be curious if, I don't know if you'd be able to share those at all. I was just kind of curious, because I know one of the key takeaways from that article is that 2 of the 3 Teslas did, in those circumstances, exceed the EPA range. Again, obviously with those caveats.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you. I don't even have them to hand. The test team crunched the numbers, and we took the view that this was not the point of the exercise. Because even if you said, okay, it's a 65 mile an hour, everybody said, oh, okay, that's like the highway then. But actually, it's not like the highway, because we were on a dedicated test facility. They were 30 seconds apart and everything else. So it just didn't feel like a real world metric to share. And that's what we're all about. Yeah, I'm sure there was internal interest in what they all did, but it was an academic interest and kind of detracted it. As I said, the whole point of doing that was just to normalize the computers and normalize the cars and level the playing fields. And the extent, the lengths that we went to. I was there, and the lengths that we get into was kind of amusing at times.
Yeah, for sure.
Driver pit stops, wiping down cars, all sorts of things.
Yeah. I think that, that's most of the questions that I had about it. Personally, if I could just advocate for something, I would love to see, Tesla's retested now with that buffer sort of accounted for, like you guys did with the Model Y, in more similar temperature conditions that isn't 50 degrees.
What do you mean by that, Robert? Which we haven't accounted for the buffer in the range test result, because as I say, we're continuing to say actually it's down to an indicated zero, because that's consumer first.
So maybe I'm wrong on my understanding here, but you guys retested the Model Y right after these tests. Is that correct?
We did the Model Y and the Model 3 performance. Basically, we were testing the buffer. This was not about redoing the Model 3 long range. Sorry, performance. The long range we hadn't previously tested, so that was an important one for us to add to the list. And that's actually gone to the top of our range list. So there's no agenda here. I get it. It's very strange in my job because I get it from everywhere. 1 minute you've been paid by this person, then you've been paid by this person, and it's so I believe me, it's not just Tesla. I hear it from every direction. So the reality was we wanted to basically look at the difference between the buffer on the test track and the buffer on the real world roads to repeat our test out, and that's why we repeated the test. It was about looking at the buffer, not about repeating the trim test. It was just we called out that the Model Y achieved the same mileage, and we obviously added the Model 3 performance range because we hadn't tested that previously.
Long range.
But it was about looking at the buffer primarily.
So the 345 that the long range got, that was going to 0 indicated. That does not include any of the buffer?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that is per our testing parameters, yeah. So one of the things I think that you called out previously about what we're saying in the video that you've seen is even if you allow for the range, these hit, these don't. But actually in our leaderboard, which is, let's face it, the bit that we care about most, because that's the real world test, we're continuing to run to 0 indicated range because I think that's the right thing to do.
Okay. So if you were truly showing the full range, you would add 17 miles to that 345 miles. That would account for the buffer essentially based on the test that you guys completed for that Model 3 long range.
Yeah, I forget I think it was 17 miles on the road loop, wasn't it? So yes, you could hypothetically add that to the 17 miles. Yeah.
Okay, that's where it just gets like a little bit frustrating as a Tesla supporter of like, okay,
but equally,
if the test conditions were the same as the EPA, going from 100 to 0%, then it would have exceeded the EPA range. So it just feels a little bit disingenuous, especially in that case, to say that it doesn't, when you're also subtracting, 15 miles of usable range.
Yeah, and we can probably disagree on this one, but I come back to my point about the consumer. I think because the range is a variable, it's indeterminate, and because we would never advocate a consumer driving to that extent. I don't think the consumer would expect a range beyond an indicated 0 to be included in the EPA rating either, and we actually state that. So I think when you look at it, what would most people expect? What would most people? This is about people buying cars and living with them. So what we're saying is, if you're a potential Tesla customer or potential Porsche customer, come to edmunds.com/range, look at these numbers. It's another indicator alongside the EPA figures. And, this is what we would expect a realistic range to be in, but this is with all the caveats of being in Southern California. So if you're in Michigan and it's cold and it's winter, don't expect to hit these figures. If you drive aggressively, don't expect to hit these figures. But we just think this is a great snapshot for anybody buying an EV today. And we will continue to test every EV in exactly the same parameters to look at that and say, okay, that suits my lifestyle. That doesn't suit my lifestyle. And if you're a Tesla, can't speak this morning. Friday morning, isn't it? A Tesla
happens to me all the time.
A Tesla customer, you might look at that, and I bought a standard range plus because I figured that suited our lifestyle. But I might also look at that and say, you know what, really, we should fork out a bit more for a Model 3 long range because we need those extra miles. And our point is, if you're simply going off the EPA figures, that's one measure. But we believe actually this is a very good approximation for what the customer will achieve. So we want to give our readers, viewers, everything else, a realistic expectation of what to expect, and that's what we do.
Yeah, and again, I think there's definitely merit to that. And you guys talk about like not charging to 100% and stuff like that. I think that's all valid stuff. I just where the rub gets me is kind of the headlines and the comparisons that aren't necessarily direct. But yep, we can maybe agree to disagree on that stuff.
I think we probably will. I think as a consumer, you look at the EPA figures and say, great, that's what I'm going to get. And what we're saying is, well, in some brands, Porsche Taycan 4S, they EPA 203 miles, Edmunds test 323 miles. It is, if you look at then a Model X long range, Edmunds test 294, EPA 328. Now, that's just relevant information for people looking at those vehicles and deciding which one to buy. It doesn't make a Tesla a bad choice. We say this in the film. It always makes me laugh because I get so much oh, this is wrong, or you're anti-Tesla. We strongly recommend a Model 3. It's our top-rated EV. So it's not about saying this Tesla is good, this Tesla is bad, or the Porsche is fantastic. There's significant issues if the EPA is showing 203 miles and a Taycan 4S will actually go 323. That's a whole different story. And just because it's positive doesn't make it right. So, there's a whole other story to this as well. What we're saying is, behind all of this is a comprehensive review and test of each vehicle, which you can go ahead and read on Edmunds.com and then work out whether this car is right for you. We're fans of Teslas. We think, company's done a great job in many ways. We're fans of other EVs, and we'll just continue to offer an independent, data-driven thing. I mean, we have our own test facilities, and we spend a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of time testing these vehicles as empirically as we possibly can.
Well, that's the best we can ask for. So appreciate you taking the time. I would love it if you guys get another 70-degree day out there to get that Tesla over 353. I'm sure it would happen, but
I'm kind of waiting. I live in LA, Rob, and I don't think it's 70 degrees for a while now. I'm kind of, you can tell by the accent. I'm only recently of these parts, and
you're not native to LA
when it doesn't warm out. No, how do you believe?
Yeah. Thanks, Alistair. Where can people find more from you?
So obviously check out the main stories at edmunds.com/range or edmunds.com/Tesla Challenge. Personally, I'm on Instagram, Weaver on Cars, or Twitter, Alistair Weaver. Edmunds is Edmunds on Twitter, and edmunds.com on Instagram, if you can take all that in.
All right. I can rewind if not. Thanks for joining us. And for the rest of you guys, we'll see you again on Monday for the March 29th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.